Hey, Q&A listeners and watchers.
I am back, and this is a very frightening thing. We have Blake operating the cameras.
Hey guys, how's it going? This is going to be really fun adventure.
For those of you who are listeners only, you'll be like, okay, what's the big deal? We'll see how it goes. I don't doubt that Blake's going to be attentive to doing the cameras, but Blake and technology are not
the best of friends sometimes.
All the time, yeah.
But
and he doesn't care enough to learn all of the things technological. Like you and I enjoy technology.
It's fun to be nerdy with it.
Yes, and Blake would never have that thought. Yeah. So this is what life by faith looks like.
This is definitely one of those need to knows for me. I'm like, if someone else is running the tech, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm like, someone else could do it.
Well, we knew when we added that camera, we should all take roles, turns to shift. So it was a last minute. Hey, Blake, you want to do this? Give him a crash course. He's doing it. So
he got us through the intro.
Yep.
So kudos to him.
Exactly. That's right.
So yeah,
we are here.
We did never decide who's asking the questions.
I think you're like technically the host that way.
I'll ask the questions since he's manning the cameras.
Okay. Cool.
All right.
Because normally Blake does.
Yeah.
He does a great job, but he's on the cameras.
Yeah, that's fair.
So we'll relieve him of that duty.
Fair enough.
And last week you started a new practice where people could respond to the things that were said in the previous podcast, which we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of thoughts that came in.
I'll kick off before you have your
most of them are from me because I listened to the podcast and I was like, oh, if we're going to do that, then I can respond.
But the intention was largely for people's feedback, not necessarily our own rebuttals.
I am a people.
You are a people, but you have a microphone most weeks.
Yes, but I didn't have one last week.
Well, that's what you get.
And there were a few
vacation.
things that I felt like I needed to just speak to.
That's fair.
So, but first of all, Kyle, you wanted to publicly recant.
Well, not recant. My wife was the first one to give me feedback last week, and the only one, to be fair, and point out, because she knows my heart and she knows my thoughts very well, that she knows what I said was not received, even though she knew what I meant. So she was like, hey, you should probably say something. And now that we've started this feedback spot, I thought her feedback was a great correction. So she pointed out that my rant, and I will name it nothing other than that, it was a rant on Christian music, was probably not encouraging for those that enjoy Christian music. And I get that, and she's one of them. And as I was processing, and even talked a little bit with Blake about this, of my thinking and looking back, of how I said things came across as though I do not even like Christian music. And I would probably say most times that is the case, but it's not because I don't like it as a default. I think we have settled when Christians should be, I think, some of the most creative people. And the music that we often get is so far from creative. With ideas like how we write our music, it always seems to have to be happy. It always has to have a resolution by the end. And that's not even what we get in our Bibles. From a musical standpoint, a lot of it seems to be, from my end, at least the stuff that gets popular is really easy to play, not difficult, not creative in its musical writing. And so I think my frustration comes not because I don't like it, but because I have such high hopes for Christian music. And it seems that we settle for so far from what we could have. So I love good Christian music. I think there's a lot of potential. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But I'm sad when we don't live up to that. Not that I'm perfect, but yeah, that's my, not recanting, my clarification.
I don't disagree with you, but I think that what you're talking about is not just a Christian music thing. I think it's a pop music thing.
Sure.
But yeah, like the happy music. I'm not into pop music because I just and the simplicity of it, and so much of it is just, I'd say it's derivative.
Yeah.
Like it's just the most simple way we can create music, we will. And I like something with it in the same way.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think that's just and I would agree. I think there's also, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, Christian music is mostly all made in Nashville and has a very unique sound and the way the music is produced.
Yeah.
And you can listen to the music without any lyrics, and you can tell if it comes out of contemporary Christian music or if it comes out of something that's not Christian, because they produce the music very differently.
Totally.
So there is a difference between the two.
There's even been secular, I hate using the secular artists who I'll listen to, and I'll go, hey, they have a background in church for sure. And when I dig into it, for sure they do, because even how they write and play music is like derivative of Christian music.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah.
So then there's the rest of the things I want to address.
Yep.
Number one is you guys were talking about how much about animals I knew. And I don't know much about animals, and I don't apologize for that. Until the animal is on my plate, I really don't have any feelings at all towards it.
And they're all equally dumb at that point.
The idea that sheep are the dumbest animals on the farm comes from the book A Shepherd Looks at the 23rd Psalm, which is a really interesting book. And he talks about the sheep are the only animal on the farm that require constant supervision. And last week, the guy, I think it was Cole, who talked about chickens. Chickens do not require
No,
constant,
they don't.
but sheep do.
Interesting.
And that's where this shepherd talked about that sheep were the dumbest animal on the farm. So there is that. And then you guys talked about purity culture.
Yeah.
And my thought, I loved your answer, but I was sitting there, I was thinking, whenever the church gets the focus off of Christ, trouble happens. And that has happened countless times. And what we've endeavored to do over the last number of years in this church is just really point people to Jesus. Because whenever we get, whether it's purity culture, whether it's conservative values, whether it's liberal values, whether it's whatever, off the focus of Christ, we start messing up. So there is that. And then on the other side of it, we talked about this on the weekend a little bit, that you guys talked about sexual abuse as a result of purity culture. But we talked a little bit about how the question talked about rape culture and how that's a systemic thing.
Yeah.
And so I thought we should address that, beginning with the definition of rape culture.
Sure.
In case somebody doesn't know it. And you and I were talking on the weekend a little bit about rape culture would be a culture where sexual abuse would be tolerated.
Yeah.
And that I do think it can lend itself, the purity culture can lend itself to that because of the objectifying of women. Yeah. So I just wanted to quickly say that because I did think that when they asked about rape culture, that was a systemic thing. Yeah. Not just an individual thing. And then the last one was just I wanted to push back a little bit to you.
Totally fair.
On when you were talking about pastors.
Yep.
And we got to make sure we don't overreact. And it was in response to the question on Ravi Zacharias.
Yeah.
And I agreed with you. Yes, we shouldn't necessarily follow a person. We need to follow Christ. But we also need to remember that pastors do have 3 times in the New Testament that they have been that they're given a list of qualifications. Yep. And there is an element of follow me as I follow Christ. And I don't want to be out of balance there. Right? And I think the problem comes when we stop looking at the person as a pastor and we start looking at them as a priest. Yep. And I think that's where you guys addressed that last week in the Old Testament when they wanted a king. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it was just an interesting thought that I had, that we don't want to overcorrect and be like, well, you got to follow Jesus and I'm teaching, but then, other than that, I'm off the hook. We are broken people, but there is an element of spiritual maturity that we should have as leaders in the church.
I think part of that comes from, though, and maybe I don't mean to be defensive. I feel like if we were elevating pastors to their positions because of those characteristics that the Bible's laid out, absolutely you can have a little bit more trust. But I don't feel like as a system, church-wise, people are getting put into those positions because of those characteristics. They're getting there because they sold books or got popular. And so then we don't have this setup of like, I can trust this guy because he got put there because of those characteristics. So he's just there because he sold some books, and then all of a sudden when he lets us down, we shouldn't be surprised by that because nobody checked his qualifications.
Well, yeah, but when Jesus talked about the fruit, you'll know them by the fruit. He never envisioned the church the way we have it in the 21st century. Yeah. Like that was never, he was envisioning what the New Testament church was, which was people you had relationship with. Yeah. And you guys referenced last week the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Yeah. And I'm catching up to you. I've got the last episode, just the last one to
hopefully you got half a day to listen to it, 2.5 hours.
Yeah, that one's a long one.
But so was the second last one. Was pretty long too. Yeah. And so I'm almost done, but it just that whole idea of the celebrity pastor. Yep. And I think oftentimes there was one of the old popes who called himself the servant to the servants of God. And I always loved that. Now he was saying, I'm the servant to the priests. Yep. And in the Catholic Church, there's been this weird resurrection of the priestly role, which is where I think we get into trouble, because a priest is somebody who goes between people and God. And in the New Testament, we are all priests.
Yeah.
And so if you're a follower of Jesus, you're a priest, in that you're supposed to be somebody who is a go-between between the people who don't yet know God and the people who do.
Yeah.
So as soon as we get a small number of people who we say are priests, then that relieves the church of being the church, which is their responsibility. But just that idea of the further up in leadership you go, the greater the servant you're called to be.
Yeah.
That is your role. And so if we could get back to that in the evangelical church, that would be great. So those were just some of the things that, as I listened to the podcast, I wanted to just throw out there. And I thought, since Kyle's allowing this, I can do it.
Totally fair.
So there
So
you go.
with that said, if you have some thoughts, feedback, whenever you watch this, feel free to send them in. I think we want to keep doing this, keep the questions feeling and the podcast a little bit more current and relevant where we can. So if you've got feedback and you have our contact info, feel free to shoot it our way, email, phone number, or text, whatever, and we'll engage it in the most recent podcast when we get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I think it is nice to kind of revisit those things and to be able to clarify or elaborate on things as we feel like we might want to.
Yeah.
So let's jump into our first question. Where can we turn for evidence on the historicity of the Bible, especially of the Old Testament? How much weight should we put on evidence or the lack thereof of the historicity of the Bible in our faith? For example, if there isn't obvious historical evidence of the exodus from Egypt outside of Hebrew literature, should that affect how we read the Old Testament?
Great question. There are a wide number of pieces you can kind of start taking to answer this question. I'll start with first. I think there's lots of archaeological evidence to support certain parts of the New Testament. Even this year,
New or old? Because the question.
Oh, sorry, old. Even this year, there was a discovery. People have been skeptical of even David's kingdom and his reign for a long time, and there wasn't a lot of historical evidence regarding him as a king, and that's a pretty big piece for the Old Testament. David's kingship is a pretty important part until this year. There was discovery of some pottery that had David's name and reference to him on it and his kingdom, and so we can't say lack of evidence is a definitive at this point, because there's still evidence to be discovered. There's lots. I've actually got, I read this one, or part of it, by Erdman's Press on the reliability of the Old Testament. I'm not going to recommend buying this one. It's not a very easy, fun, just sit down and casual read. But
I was going to say, I don't think I'm going to read that one, Kyle. Just like you pulled it off the shelf and I was like, nope.
I should show it this way. So there are people who are absolutely researching and doing that work. But I will say and then I'll shut up and let somebody else talk. I also think sometimes the evidence that we do find can tell us and force us to reevaluate our assumptions in how we read the Old Testament. I'll use this one, for instance. You've mentioned, the questioner has asked the Exodus from Egypt. Now, the way most translations read the number of people who left Egypt into the millions, because of there's certain math on how they refer to a certain amount of groups, and they assumed those groups meant a certain number, but the word that was used for that group can actually be translated to a much smaller way. So instead of the millions of people wandering through the desert, it probably could have been more in the 50 to 60,000, or even smaller than that by some people's estimates, on how many people went into the desert. If we had 2 million people going to the desert, we'd find some archaeological evidence of 2 million people in the desert for 40 years. And we have not yet found that. That doesn't mean it couldn't have happened. I believe if God can feed the people from the sky, he could have sustained millions if need be. But so far, the evidence that we've found hasn't gotten there. And the biblical text, when we go back to it, does open up for other interpretations over our assumptions. And so it's kind of this piecing together of don't necessarily have to prove it. There is some good reliable evidence, but also sometimes we've come to it with assumptions. And I'll pass it off.
Well, I would just say, so about a month ago, I stumbled onto this article by the Smithsonian.
Cool.
That was really interesting, and it was all about the historical reliability of the Old Testament. And it basically talked about there are two schools of thought, and there are two schools, basically, that represent these two schools of thought in Israel. One is that the Old Testament's really kind of like Yeah. It's a lot of mythology,
Right.
and the other one is that it's historically accurate. And so this article talked about King Solomon's mines, and the whole thing was built around this idea of King Solomon's mines, and how there was no historical authenticity for it. And then there were these mines that were found, and they were thought to be King Solomon's mines. And then there was debate as to whether or not it was King Solomon's mines or they were Egyptian,
Right.
Because it was kind of on the edge of Israel.
Right.
And then there's been this whole other set of thought that come out. And the article ended by saying, we don't know.
Yeah.
There's so much. There's only so much that archaeological evidence can find. And
Yeah.
when you think about what archaeologists do, they examine the things that have remained from thousands of years,
Yeah.
and they construct theories.
Yep.
And basically, this article ended by saying there has to be more. This is my paraphrase. There has to be more kind of grace between the two camps to either say this is all mythology or this is all real, and there's no way of debating it.
Yeah.
If anyone's interested in the article, if you let me know, I can send it to you. I copied it into my OneNote.
Right.
It was a really fascinating read, but I appreciated the honest answer that this person gave about how there's the limitations of archaeological study, and what some of the more liberal schools of thought that would say this is all mythology would say is there would be archaeological remains.
Yeah.
To which what they found is proof that there were whole societies that lived nomadically in tents, but were highly structured and highly civilized.
Yeah.
And so they're like, this article was saying, you would never find any proof of that.
Yeah.
It's impossible because the tents are gone, the fabric's gone, and so there's no way of knowing.
Yeah.
And so it was basically just recognizing the limitations of the science of archaeology, and saying that whichever camp you fall on, you have to. There's a measure of faith required.
Yep. Totally.
So, yeah, I would say that too. I remember the King David thing. This is probably 20 years ago, but Time magazine had come out and said, like, King David's not in the Bible. This isn't real. And then they found a bunch of coins.
Right.
And I remember reading the Time magazine article that was the recant of, well, actually, we found coins with this inscription on it now.
Yeah.
So you never know what you're going to find future-wise. But I was thinking of just the Bible. I remember taking a class somewhere where they were just talking about how many times the Bible had been recorded.
Right.
So not necessarily whether it's truthful. I mean, you could be just recording somebody's writings, right?
Yeah.
But just that it was, the number of recordings and the number of, original copies we have outnumbers like tons of other things in history that we give credit to.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was kind of cool that, whoever kept this Bible going, whether it's the Israelites or whether it's God himself, it was done, right?
Yeah.
Like the Bible has been recorded and passed down over and over and over really well. So just wanted to throw that in there, but
Totally. No, and we find new stuff all the time. Like, so that's the cool part of like staying in touch with this. I remember there was a podcast I listened to about from Stuff You Should Know about this explosion that took place in I thought it was in the Netherlands somewhere, and it was this massive explosion, had miles and miles wide. They're assuming it's some kind of comet they're not aware of, and the only other place where they found remains similar is next to the Dead Sea in the approximate spot of Sodom. And it leaves a ton of salt behind in its wake, this type of explosion, contributing to the salt of the Dead Sea and the historicity of the salt in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, there's just certain things that come up. You're like, okay, maybe this has been... maybe this is getting into a whole nother conversation, but I feel like the Bible is also written with God inspiration for sure, but humans involved too. And so when they look back on these stories, we've got even some conflicting accounts between Chronicles and Kings, how they look back at certain things and write them there. I've heard there were edits made about David's kingdom in the age of Josiah, so that when they look at Josiah, he was a king like David, the records of David look really good, so they can say Josiah was like, and that used to really scare me hearing some of those things. But it's also God involved humans for a purpose along with the writing of scripture. And so there are certain times where we went out and we slaughtered them all. And then 3 chapters later, that same group of people's there. Did they mean they slaughtered all of them? Or is it like, hey, finished a basketball game, we killed them? and so some of those things are in there. And so we wrestle with what are our expectations when we say historicity of the Old Testament. It is absolutely true. but what is the truth it's trying to portray? That's timeless. I don't think that can be argued with. And there's archaeology that will support, I think, a wide array, if not the majority, of what we see in the Old Testament as we give it time.
I was watching a Michael Heiser video a couple of days ago, and it was on inerrancy.
Yeah.
And whether the Bible's inerrant. And I loved his answer. He said, you can't impose a modern standard on an ancient document.
Yeah.
The way that we've decided in the last 100 years, this is how we will record history.
Yeah.
And we will have, when anything happens, I think about 9/11.
Yeah.
And they articulated to the number of people who were killed on 9/11 because it was important and it mattered.
Yeah.
And in the thousands of years ago, they didn't do that. They didn't keep the records of it. There was no way of knowing. So they rounded everything off. When you look at the Bible and it says, 12,000 people were slaughtered.
Yeah.
Well, was it exactly 12,000 and who counted?
Yeah.
No, but that's imposing a modern standard on an ancient document.
Yeah.
And so when it says we slaughtered them all, if you read through the Old Testament, you see how many times Israel went out to war. Not necessarily the whole nation went.
Yeah.
So they could have slaughtered the entire army that was gathered against them.
Yep.
Right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that the whole nation was.
Yep.
And so, we have to be careful not to impose a modern standard on an ancient document. I really appreciated that thought. But then he also talked about we speak inerrancy. We speak errantly all the time.
Yep.
Like we say, the sun rose this morning. That's actually an error because the sun doesn't rise. The earth rotates.
Yep.
Right? So it's things like that you go, okay, what is the heart behind the document? What is the heart behind the Bible? What is the heart behind it? I don't think that the Bible was ever written with the purpose of being a science textbook.
No.
That was not the intention of it. So when we make it a science textbook, we're again applying a modern standard to an ancient document.
Yeah.
They weren't worried about defining the Big Bang and the process of the Big Bang in the Genesis. And I only use that as an example. But, they're recording the history of their nation from oral tradition.
Yep.
And so there's going to be a simplification, for lack of a better term. I don't know what other term, maybe a generalization of some of these things.
Yep.
And there's going to be some discontinuities between some of those oral traditions. But on all the main things and all the big things, the Bible is pretty unified. And we can find a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah.
So, but that leads us right into our next question. So it says, I love Q&A. Thank you. 2 questions. And then there's only one question.
I broke them up for sake of us being able to have them.
Okay.
Because they weren't related.
Okay.
When I put them in our notes.
First one, Kyle. So this one's to you, Kyle. A while back, you touched on the Book of Jonah. Do you view it as literal or historical?
I'm sure we can all jump in on this one. I do not view it as literal. I feel like the literal or historical seem one and the same.
I think what they mean is
one of the
literally happened, or maybe they use the word historical, or metaphorical.
Yeah, and I would lean more on the metaphorical end. A number of things contributing to it. If you read through Jonah, the language of it is, I believe, intentionally hyperbolic. Then everything is extreme. How large Nineveh is to walk across, and how many people, and how quickly they get saved, and how great the storm is, and I feel like everything seems to be great and large, trying to make an extreme case out of it. There is a prophet named Jonah that's also mentioned in another part of the Old Testament, and then historically he's looked upon as kind of a bad prophet. Like he didn't do a good job.
The Book of Jonah is not really an endorsement of the person.
Outside of the Book of Jonah, that prophet who's mentioned is looked upon poorly, and so to almost take this idea of a bad person known as Jonah, know the name, and write this story to say, hey, this is what happened, to make this wisdom literature as such, using a hyperbolic story is there. I don't think it. I'm not opposed to it being real if that is the case. I don't think it's impossible for God to have saved anything. It's not down to the science of could somebody have survived though that may play a part in somebody's wrestle with it. But I think even just largely the language doesn't lend itself to being a literal account, nor does it seem that's the point of the book. It's not a historical book like some of the other ones, like Kings and Chronicles, like Exodus or Numbers or Deuteronomy. It's not trying to record and accurately present something. I think it's trying to make a point bigger, and that falls more in the nature of meditation literature. Again, I'd be happy to be wrong, but that's just where I land right now. I don't see it as literal or historical.
So then do you think in the Christian Bible it is not put in the right section? Because it's put in with the prophetic books, and you're calling it part of the wisdom literature. Okay, so for those who maybe don't know, the Old Testament would be divided into 3 sections. There's the history, there's the wisdom, and there's the prophetic.
Yeah.
And the history would be pretty much everything up until Psalms. And then you've got, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon. Is there any other in the wisdom?
So Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon gets put in there.
Ecclesiastes.
Yep.
And so would you say that the book of Jonah should be included with the wisdom literature? Because twice you referred to it as wisdom literature.
I believe it should be, and if I may be wrong, I believe it's actually been placed there in certain manuscripts that we have as well.
Would it be in the Jewish Bible? Again, for those who might not know, we know the Old Testament is the Jewish Bible, but it's not. They're not in the same order.
I'll look that up right now as we talk.
I'm just curious. I'm just the way you talked about it. It just popped that question up in my mind. So while you're looking that up, Blake, you want to address this question?
I really have never read the book, so
you've never read Jonah?
No.
Really?
Is it?
Oh man,
is it a good one?
Dude, it's amazing.
It's one of my favorite books in the Bible.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's one of my top 5.
Sorry. I'm I thought we were talking. I'm trying to text. Sorry, guys. I have. Here's my techie thing going on. I just realized that I have work that needs to be done here, so I'm trying to text people who are not in this room to take care of that work.
So I shouldn't have thrown it over.
No, you threw to me, and I was not ready at all. So the Book of Jonah. Sorry, I thought we were talking about extra biblical literature. Nope. I was not even paying attention to who you were talking about.
All
Sorry.
Good.
So I will throw back to you guys.
All right, put it back on the camera over here. We'll ignore you until you give us a thumbs up that you're ready.
So it is in even the Jewish ordering placed in the minor prophets.
Okay.
But to just put it out there and finish the thought, the wisdom literature that's ordered there is Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles are all placed in wisdom literature.
Really?
Yep.
Interesting. Okay, that's cool. Because I would have put Ezra and Nehemiah in with the history since there's so much history there.
Yeah, well, Ezra and Nehemiah, I thought, and maybe this article is not putting them in the proper order, I thought Ezra and Nehemiah was the conclusion of... No, it is Chronicles. Nope, you're right. It's right. Never mind. I take it back.
It's all good.
But,
cool.
So, yeah, I don't hold it to be literal. But
all right.
Heretic. I'll say it for you.
I didn't say it I don't know. I could see both sides to the argument.
I do too.
And that's where I'm like I looked at this question. I was like, I don't know that I necessarily have an opinion on this. I love the Book of Jonah.
Yeah.
And I think if you think the Book of Jonah is about the Ninevites, you don't know what the Book of Jonah is about.
Yeah.
It's clearly about Jonah, and it's really a story, whether it's real or whether it's a metaphor. It's a story about how God will move through anyone, and how God is always trying to work in our lives, and God is gracious.
Yeah.
Even to those people who are judgmental, because there's Jonah's so self-righteous in the book, and he thinks he's all good.
Yeah.
And yet God, he doesn't see that God is as gracious to him as he accuses God of being gracious to the Ninevites.
Yeah.
And it really is any one of us can be Jonah.
Yep.
And I think every one of us has at some time been Jonah.
Yeah.
And it is really something that speaks to humanity.
Yeah.
Although there's a face on it and his name is Jonah, or name on it, I guess his name is Jonah, it could have any one of our names in it.
I think and that's where I take the purpose of it. Even if it is ultimately historical, or at the very least based in history, like maybe there was a guy named Jonah who did go to Nineveh, who had a bunch of people saved, but then they're taking this and making it that much more extreme as they put this down for us all to see. I can be a Jonah sometimes, and all those pieces, but.
Yeah. Well, I remember somebody saying that Jonah is the greatest missions book in the Old Testament because like his message is only like 8 words long, and then the whole city gets saved. And I'm like, that's because the point is not the Ninevites. The point is Jonah. Like clearly, the writer of Jonah doesn't. His ministry to the Ninevites is not the point of the book.
Yeah, it seems to be at the very least made extreme in some ways, even if it is historical. Like looking at Nineveh specifically as just one of the examples. There's no city in the ancient Near East that was 3 days to walk across. Like that, you could walk to 3 different cities within a day, let alone one city over 3 days kind of thing.
I don't know that there'd be too many in the world today.
No. But I think in that case, like there's even at the very least elements that have been adjusted to make the point for us to really wrestle with and think. It talks constantly about how down Jonah goes. He gets lower and lower and lower to make this point. All those things. So at the very least, it's been embellished, I think, to help us see ourselves in it.
Yeah.
I will jump in now that I've caught up to what we're talking about and say 2 things that I think of Jonah. Not necessarily that they make them accurate for sure, but Jesus references that he's going to be 3 days in the grave as Jonah was in 3 days, the belly of the whale. I think that's pretty cool. And obviously if Jesus is noting it, then he's at least giving it, I guess, some weight, right? He's saying, you guys know this story, so I'm going with it, right? And the other one is, and I heard this, and so again, whether it's totally accurate or not, but during what was the last terrorist uprising? It's not Al-Qaeda, but the
ISIS.
When ISIS hit, I remember hearing missionary reports at some point. I was working at the Alliance Church at that time, and they said that in Nineveh, or the city that is still there, that there is quite a Christian a group of people there. Like Christianity has always had a very big foothold there.
Yeah.
And the report that we heard was that's dating right back to the days of Jonah. Like since Jonah had come to that city, that there'd always been Christians in that city. So you never know.
There couldn't have been Christians
I was going to say
since Jonah was there, because Jonah was there hundreds of years before Jesus.
Well, yes.
Right, at least 500-600 years. But
the followers of
the faith,
of the
Sorry.
faith.
Okay. Yes.
Judaism that came to Christ.
I think Jesus' knowledge too was, I agree, that gives it some weight as a book and authority and inspiration. I don't know if that speaks to its historicity. Jesus says that the mustard seed's the smallest of all seeds. We know that's not true.
Right.
His language and his knowledge, to a degree, were limited in that time by his humanity.
Absolutely.
And so he's speaking in the same way. So I guess you go, okay, he seems to reference Enoch, which we've talked about. So does that make Enoch 100% authoritative and all those pieces? So I go, yes, Jesus acknowledging it gives it weight and credence. There's a difference between that and making it historical.
Yes, I agree with that.
But the way that Jesus references it,
and
I'm not arguing against you.
No, well, that's what it's for, though. So feel free.
No, I'm not arguing against you because I think you're wrong, but I think it actually supports your argument that it's not historical.
Right.
Is that the way that Jesus references it?
Yeah.
Right. He's talking about his own death and his own resurrection, and he says, "Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, so will I."
Yeah.
There's countless times in our world today that we reference a common story to use in our own life, that if I said to you something from Star Wars, you might understand what I'm talking about, but neither one of us thinks it's historical.
Totally.
And neither one of us feels the need to clarify. Just so we're all aware, when I reference myself as Darth Vader, I'm not actually saying I believe Darth Vader really exists.
Totally.
Like, that doesn't happen. And so the way that Jesus references Jonah, I don't know if that is an endorsement of its historicity. But if the people in the ancient in ancient Bible times viewed it as a metaphor or a hyperbolic story, then they still would have known the story that Jesus could have referenced it in the context that he did. So I don't know that Jesus' reference of it is Jesus' endorsement of its historicity. That's all I'm saying there.
I feel like that lends itself to a whole broader conversation. Maybe I'm doing some more fishing for questions, but I feel like that
You can do that because we are getting close to the end of the list. We talked about being in having a long backlog, but we're
getting much shorter. But I feel like that's one of my frustrations with the inerrancy argument that we've already alluded to today. You find one thread and the whole thing has to fall apart, right? If we can say Jonah is not historical, if we could prove that somehow, I don't think you can, but if you could, then the whole of the Old Testament falls apart in its authority. And I feel like hinging it on an expectation that the Bible doesn't give of itself is a dangerous place to get into. But
I would say that only applies if, and I don't know that we know the answer to this, the ancient readers viewed it as history. And so, again, I'm going to reference another Michael Heiser video. I've been watching a lot of Michael Heiser videos.
He's awesome.
On YouTube. And I love Michael Heiser. The book Supernatural was one of the book club books. If you want to read an interesting book, read that book. But I'm watching a lot of his videos on YouTube. And he talks about that in the modern world, we assume that the people in the ancient world were stupid.
Yeah.
And he's like, and they weren't.
No.
Like when people in the ancient world read Genesis with the fall of man and a talking snake, they didn't believe there was a talking snake.
Totally.
They knew how snakes operated.
Yep.
And they knew this was a story designed to prove a point.
Yeah.
And we get into the 21st century and we've got technology and we're like, well, they were simple things. And they weren't dumb.
Yeah.
They may not have had the technology we have, and they might not have understood some of the inner workings of the universe that scientists have at this point figured out, but they knew the anatomy of a snake.
Yep.
And they knew that snakes didn't talk.
Yep.
And so they just accepted the story as the story
Yep.
to prove a point in a way that we have kind of lost sight of. And then we're either like, the Bible needs to get thrown out because it talks about a talking snake, or if you believe it, you're dumb because you believe in a talking snake.
Yeah.
But then we can go and watch a movie where there would be something that wouldn't really happen. We could go watch a Marvel movie and see a talking raccoon, and we're okay with it because we understand the context of it.
Yeah. Or even derive meaning from it into our lives.
Yeah. And his point was that in the ancient world, nobody thought there was a talking snake.
Yep.
And I was like, that's a really good point.
Yep.
We that's an us issue because we're saying we're so much smarter than everyone who read this book 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago and beyond.
Totally.
So, yeah.
So there's our fishing for inerrancy questions.
I would also say, just on this topic, we've recommended this book before, but the book Irresistible by Andy Stanley, where the questions, most of the time where people reach a point of walking away from faith, surround issues that are not related to Jesus, who's the one we're called to follow. We're not called to follow the Bible. We're called to follow Jesus.
Yep.
And the Bible helps point us to Jesus. And we need to get that right.
Yep.
So I'll just throw that out there, and then we will move on.
Okay, cool.
All right. So next question. So this is part 2 of the 2 questions that you received. And I don't know if this one's just addressed. I'm assuming this one's addressed to all of us, although we all spoke to the last one. What are your views on Joyce Meyer's teachings? And do you consider her a prosperity preacher? Thank you.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
You're looking at me like I'm starting, so I guess I'll start.
Well, I don't feel like I should ask the question and then start.
That's fair.
And Blake's texting on his phone.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I'll jump in. I have read a little bit of Joyce Meyer. I looked into her and watched some of her videos in a time where these accusations of her prosperity teaching were flying pretty prevalently. But I will not speak as a person who knows the whole discography of Joyce Meyers and her books and her readings and all those pieces. I don't like to be one who will quickly brush one person off. I don't think cancel culture is a healthy thing, Christian or not. I don't, as much as we joke about calling somebody a heretic and writing them off, we joke about that because of how prevalent it seems to be in some certain camps of Christianity and how ridiculous we find it to be. So I will say, I have definitely heard some things of Joyce Meyer that lend themselves towards prosperity type teaching. There are other things of Joyce Meyer, though, that I think can be good and beneficial. I haven't read the book, but I know our ladies are doing a study on Battle of the Mind by Joyce Meyers right now. If we were adamantly against her and thought she's a complete snake and needs to be thrown out of the church, that wouldn't be happening in our
a talking snake.
A talking snake. She would be a talking snake, or at least a writing snake. And so I don't like the idea of writing somebody off. I will say, and somebody could probably look at one of my messages and go, hey, that was a little prosperity leaning, Kyle. I can't think of anything in particular, but I'm sure it's out there. I get called a heretic weekly on this podcast. So there are things, and I hope nobody's written me off entirely yet. I will say, like I said, I think there are some things that can lean themselves there, and other things that I don't find she goes very deep with and can be very surface level and therefore not necessarily as helpful as some people would hope. But I haven't written her off. I think there's some good things she's contributed, and you can learn something from everybody.
All right. So I think there's a bigger topic here of prosperity preachers and what that means.
There always is a bigger topic when we look
Right?
at these questions, it seems.
So I think I oftentimes let's define it.
Yep.
And so let's define what a prosperity preacher is. I feel like we need to do that because I feel like it's at least something that a bunch of different people would have a bunch of different opinions on.
Yeah.
Because you can say as soon like that, calling someone a prosperity preacher can be thrown around like an accusation.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that I could say it and you could say it and we could mean two totally different things by it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, for me, when I hear prosperity preacher, I would say, name it, claim it. God always wants you healthy and wealthy.
Yeah.
That would be my idea of a prosperity preacher.
Right.
Would you guys say that'd be your definition as well?
In part, I would say in part, and I'm borrowing this from Sky Jitani. He defined there's a new realm of prosperity teaching that we've stepped into because the world, Christians and non-Christians alike, can see through a lot of those extremes. I'm sure we can talk about some of those. But it's shifted from if you do this, you'll get health and wealth immediately to this. If you accept Jesus, you'll have the good life, and you follow us, and you'll have the good life. And it's all about a vibrancy of life might be how I described it. If you follow Jesus, your life will be vibrant and awesome and Instagram worthy. It's kind of the picture that gets portrayed. And maybe there needs to be a defining between those two, but I feel like it's the new version of prosperity teaching. If you follow us, your life will prosper in the way you deem. And now this generation just defines it and deems it in a different way. So I might be a little bit more vague than you.
That's interesting, Colin. It kind of leads into what I was going to say. I definitely grew up non-charismatic.
Yep.
And so for me, a prosperity teaching was definitely money related for sure. I think health was in there as well. But also that idea, I think, Doug, you kind of alluded to it anyways, that if you do, or maybe Kyle, you just said this, if you do this, you'll get blessed. And it's typically if you gave money to the church, then you're going to receive the answer to your prayer or whatever else. That to me is prosperity. But I had a really interesting conversation with one of the leaders of the Christian Missionary Alliance here in Canada when our church in Airdrie, the Alliance Church, started seeing healings happening.
Right.
Is this idea of what can we expect from God and how easy it is to shift into the idea that if God, or if Jesus specifically wants us to be healthy and offers healing, then if we walk properly with Jesus, seeking relationship with him, we should receive benefits.
Yeah.
And in that conversation, he was saying, I understand by saying that how easily that slips into a prosperity type thinking.
Right.
And so he was asking me how we navigate that or how we work around it. And we had a really interesting conversation in a coffee shop trying to talk about what is prosperity teaching and what is just healthy expectation of walking a life with Jesus, right? Yeah. But I would definitely say, to me, it's when either what's being taught or what I'm receiving is the expectation of health and wealth more so than relationship with Jesus. Once that becomes my goal is higher than just relationship, I think I've stepped into
the benefits of Jesus more than the person of Jesus.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if that makes sense.
Yep. So the reason why I wanted to define it was when I think about this question, I think that we typically put people in boxes. Yeah. And I don't think it's a box. I think it's a sliding scale.
Yep, totally.
And when you think about if you had a soteriological or salvation, soteriology is all about salvation. That's what it is. It's the subject of salvation. If you had a soteriological spectrum, right? And at this end, it was no expectations of anything, come to Jesus and suffer.
Yeah, the
And
desert fathers.
Exactly. And at this end was, come to Jesus and life will be great. Everyone's on a spectrum there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the people who are at one spot on the spectrum always look at people who are at another spot of the spectrum and say they're false teachers.
Totally.
Yeah.
And what they fail to realize is the reason there's a whole spectrum is because there's elements of all of that are right.
Yep.
And I have such a hard time with this need to put everybody in a box and a need to define everything and then say why everybody's a false teacher or wrong or this or that. Because all we're doing is we're saying my spot on the spectrum is the right spot.
Yep.
And I have seen people who buy into and go really to this end of the spectrum. And I'm not going to name any names, but I've seen preachers who are way over on this spectrum. And I go, okay, maybe you're in a different spot on the spectrum than I am. And maybe I would never preach that. But there's an element and a nugget of truth in that people over here need to get.
Sure.
And I think we need to mature in the faith. I was talking to somebody a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about maturing. And I was like, according to Ephesians, as we mature in our faith, we'll come to more unity in the faith, which only makes sense. As we become more and more like Jesus, we will think more and more alike. There's going to be this narrowing that takes place. And I think the fact that 2,000 years after Jesus died, rose, and ascended to heaven, we still have this wide, massive spectrum is an indication of the fact that we haven't done a very good job of maturing in our faith.
Yeah.
But we found our comfortable spot on the spectrum, and then we sit there.
Yeah.
And so would I put Joyce Meyers maybe a little more on this end of the spectrum, on the prosperity or the health and wealth end of the spectrum than maybe where I would be? Probably. But she also has done a lot of teaching on knowing your identity and knowing who you are in Christ that I've heard. And even the battlefield of the mind that the ladies are doing. Like there's some powerful truths in there that we all need to understand, that our mind is a battlefield, and that when we believe lies, those lies hold us back and keep us from the fullness of life that Jesus has for us.
Yeah.
And I think that what I'm seeing in the broader church right now, in many places, is this reaction to the prosperity preaching. And again, I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. But I'm seeing this shift, and I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about something, and I was like, basically what you're doing is you've now created a soteriology that has zero expectation of God ever doing anything.
Yep.
Right? And it's just this, like we're going to follow Jesus, and maybe it's going to be terrible, but we're not going to expect anything from God.
Yep.
And I'm like, I think God wants more faith from us than that. And I don't think I'm way over here on the spectrum.
Yep.
But I do think that it's a spectrum, and I think we need to learn to look to the people at different spots on the spectrum and go, maybe I don't need to go all the way there.
Yep.
But is there something in what they're saying that I could take and I could learn from, and that God could use to bring me into more of the fullness of life?
Yep. Great thought.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, the one end you're speaking to and saying, I would say historically, or at least what I have experienced in my life and seen, that people who expect more miraculous or that kind of thing experience more of it.
Yeah.
And I think there is a faith element to that. I think when I stop expecting that, I'm probably not going to see it, right? So I would say I have to get off that end. That end doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
But if we go to the other, I think we're shifting on this spectrum.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't. It's not like maybe we carve out a spot and we sit there forever, but that's not what we should do either. We should kind of be like on like a roller coaster track, kind of shifting back and forth as God leads us into truth.
Totally.
Until we find the exact middle ground, which I don't think will happen until we get to heaven.
No.
Because yes, I absolutely agree with you, Blake, that it's almost, there's this rising idea of a spirituality that is so wonderful because it expects God to do nothing. And it's just like, there's a song that was a popular song a number of years ago, and Lordy was playing it one day, and I was like, I hate this song.
Yeah.
And Lord is like, how can you hate this song? I said, because basically the song is, no matter how much God lets me down, no matter how bad life gets, I'm still going to praise you, God. Which A, just says I have no expectation of God, but B, is like, no matter how bad God treats me, I'm still committed to him. Basically, we're talking about how great we are,
right?
In that we're going to praise you, no matter how terrible. And I'm like, it's not a noble thing to have no expectation of God to move.
Yeah.
No.
It seems noble because we're like, man, I'm going to serve and I'm going to love God no matter what, no matter how little he does for me. But if a child went to their father or mother and said, I'm going to love you no matter how bad you treat me, the parent wouldn't be like, bless you, my child. That's great.
Well, that's even Jesus, right? If your kid asks for you for a fish, and you wouldn't give him a snake or all those pieces. Like he gets right into exactly that. Yep. We can have good expectations of God because He is good, but we cannot be pursuing those or expecting those or let our faith crumble in those moments, or think that.
I think we can expect them though, and I think we should expect. Like I talked a couple weeks ago in our in-person gathering about expectancy,
and there's the difference
versus expectation.
Because I feel like some people come to the table on the extreme of God working, and if the prosperity, back to maybe how we loosely defined it, if I do A, B, C, God will do what I demanded is D.
Yes.
Right, and that's the issue where when we look. I believe God heals, but I don't think there's a certain formula to shift God's will to make sure this person gets healed.
Correct.
And those kind of things, I think, are the opposite of extreme from God will never do anything for me, but I'm happy anyways because I'm so faithful, to if I do this magic incantation and say these words the proper way, I shift God's will to do exactly what I want.
Yep.
And it's in the middle where we should be. And Francis Chan, his new book, I haven't read it yet, but Until Unity, I've listened to a couple interviews with him on that, and I love where he's at. So if you want to listen to something good on this too, find Francis Chan or read the book. And
I listened to a podcast with him a while back and
Until
really
Unity,
appreciated his perspective on where the church is at and the need to embrace some of the people in the Christian community that we haven't embraced and learn from them. And he talks about, in the one podcast I was listening, going and speaking to some Catholics who began the thing by washing he goes to this conference or this meeting, and before they let him speak, they wash his feet. And they're just talking to him. They're like, thank you so much for coming. Like we want you to help us do better at bringing Jesus to our neighbors. And he's sitting there and he talks in the podcast about his wrestling. Like, I'm wrestling with this because I'm like, you guys got some theology I totally disagree with, and I've always disagreed with, and yet at the same time, you have such a love for Jesus. How do I reconcile this? And if you know how Francis Chan talks and you can hear his exasperated voice, he's very engaging. But I appreciate that. So I would say that maybe she's in a different spot than us, and I think there does come a place where, like Paul talks about, preaching a different gospel, presenting a different Christ. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. That is a place. Where that line is, I don't know, but I try to include as many people on this side of it as I can.
Right.
Whereas what I see happening in the church is you differ theologically from me in one area, therefore that's a different gospel and you're presenting a different Christ.
Anathema.
I think we should be as inclusive as we can, not as exclusive as we can.
Yep.
I agree with that.
So, all right. Well, there we go. We have gone long enough. We're at 53 minutes, so we will let people go.
That leaves us 2 questions.
Nope.
3, sorry.
3 more questions.
3 questions.
So that gives us 3 for next week, which we did 3 and the feedback part this week. So if you have feedback, if something we said you want us to address or maybe clarify, or you want to just call Kyle a heretic, send us a comment and we will gladly do that next week. I don't think anybody called you a heretic.
I called myself a heretic at one point.
That's on you.
I just preemptively did it and robbed you of the joy.
No, you didn't say anything heretical, so I didn't feel the need. So, see?
Because we're growing closer in our Christian maturity.
I'm trying to be as inclusive as I can.
I feel like we have been having more just embellishing with one another than conflicting the last while.
Well, I don't feel like you and I differ that much in our theology.
It's more just for show, right?
I just think that you just say things in a more sensational way.
That's fair. That's probably true. That's true.
But anyway, thank you for being with us. It is great to have you join us, whether you are watching us live or later, or whether you're listening to us only on the podcast. That is awesome. So thank you for being a part of this. If you have a question, send it in. If you have a comment, send it in. We love to hear from you. You are the ones who are driving this show, and we're almost at the end of the road. So there you go.
Cool.
So we'll see you again next week.